There is a question that the record of American organized crime has never been able to answer definitively. It is not a question about what happened. The facts are largely established. The convictions, the cooperations, the sentences, the dismantled hierarchies, these are in the public record, documented across thousands of pages of court filings, government reports, and investigative journalism that spans more than half a century. The question is whether any of it mattered in the way the institutions that produced it claimed it did. By the time Joseph Massino walked out of federal custody in 2013, a free man, having received credit for time served in exchange for a cooperation that was described by federal prosecutors as among the most comprehensive ever provided by a defendant. At that level, the organized crime landscape in the United States had been transformed, or appeared to have been transformed, in ways that advocates of the prosecution strategy pointed to as evidence of its success. The 5 New York families were diminished. Their membership was reduced. Their public visibility was near zero. Their capacity for the kind of coordinated multifamily operations that had characterized the high period of American organized crime in the mid-20th century was, by most assessments, severely limited. Massino's cooperation had contributed to more than 80 convictions. It had produced information that led to the location of human remains. It had helped close cases that had been open for decades. It had, in the specific and measurable sense of prosecutorial outcomes, worked. And yet, the prosecution succeeded. The record confirms this. What the record leaves unresolved is something harder, what success of that kind actually means, and what it left behind. This is the attempt to describe that honestly. The practical output of Massino's cooperation, the specific documentable prosecutorial results, exceeded what most legal observers had predicted when the cooperation agreement was first reported. The number that has been cited in various public accounts is approximately 15 significant indictments directly attributable to information Massino provided, in addition to the broader pool of more than 80 convictions that his testimony and debriefings contributed to across multiple prosecutions. The precise accounting is difficult to verify from the public record alone, because not all cooperation debriefings produce identifiable downstream cases, and because some of what Massino provided was folded into ongoing investigations whose publicly stated origins do not credit him specifically. What is documentable is the scope. He provided first-hand accounts of murders that had gone uninvestigated or had been investigated without sufficient evidence to produce charges. He identified the locations of remains that had not been recovered in at least 3 documented cases. Human remains were located based on information he provided, allowing families of victims who had been missing for years to receive confirmation and, eventually, the legal resolution that formal identification enables. He provided detailed accounts of the organizational structure of the Bonanno family across a 30-year period, the decision-making processes, the financial channels, the personnel who held authority at various levels, the specific arrangements that governed relationships between the Bonanno family and other New York families through the commission structure. This organizational map became a reference document for federal investigators across multiple subsequent cases. He provided information about law enforcement interactions. This dimension of his cooperation is the least fully documented in the public record. Some of what he said in this area remains sealed, and the investigative threads it opened have not been fully reported publicly. What is established is that this dimension existed and that federal prosecutors considered it significant. He testified at 6 separate criminal trials. In each case, his testimony was delivered under oath, subject to cross-examination, and was assessed by juries who returned convictions. The defense attorneys who cross-examined him across those proceedings described his testimony as detailed, internally consistent, and difficult to undermine through standard credibility attacks. The consistency was not, as those attorneys acknowledged, the consistency of a coached or fabricated account. It was the consistency of a man who had been present for the events he was describing and whose memory of them was specific. The most significant single use of his cooperation, beyond the testimony at Massino's own former associates' trials, was the case against Vincent Bassiano. Massino had been acting boss of the Bonanno family during Massino's pre-trial detention. He had been charged with murder, racketeering, and related offenses. The government's case against him included evidence developed through the recordings Massino had made the wire he had worn against his own successor while both men were in federal custody. Those recordings produced statements that prosecutors used to establish elements of the case that documentary evidence alone could not have reached. Massino was convicted. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentence carried a specific institutional weight. Massino had been the man positioned to rebuild the Bonanno family in the aftermath of the cascade of cooperations that Vitale had initiated. His conviction removed the organizational leadership that would have been necessary to reconstitute the family at the level it had operated under Massino. The family continued to exist, but it continued in a form that was structurally different, smaller, less hierarchical, less capable of the sustained coordination that had characterized its operations under the previous generation of leadership. Seen in isolation, the results appeared comprehensive. Seen against the longer arc of what followed, the picture became more complicated. To assess what the Massino prosecution and his cooperation actually accomplished, it is necessary to understand what organized crime prosecution was designed to do, what the specific theory of the RICO strategy, as it was developed and implemented from 1970 onward, claimed it would achieve. The theory was straightforward. Organized crime derived its power from continuity, from the ability to maintain institutional structures across generations, to preserve accumulated capital and operational knowledge through personnel changes, and to sustain the network of relationships with legitimate institutions that gave the criminal enterprise access to resources that purely illegal organizations lacked. RICO prosecution, by targeting the enterprise rather than the individual, was designed to attack continuity, to make the institutional structure itself the object of prosecution, to produce outcomes that disrupted not just the individuals who currently held positions in the hierarchy, but the hierarchy itself. This theory rested on an assumption. The assumption was that criminal enterprises, like legitimate ones, depended on institutional infrastructure that could be dismantled, and that dismantling it would produce a durable reduction in criminal capacity. The assumption was partially correct. The RICO prosecutions of the 1980s and 1990s, and the Massino prosecution in particular, did dismantle the institutional infrastructure of the New York families in measurable ways. The leadership structures were disrupted, the financial channels were traced and closed, the formal hierarchy, the boss, underboss, consigliere, captains, soldiers structure that had been the operational backbone of the families for decades was made extremely difficult to maintain in anything like its historical form, because every member who occupied a formal position within it was now a potential target of a RICO conspiracy charge. What the prosecutions did not dismantle was the underlying structure that had made the families powerful in the first place. The labor-union relationships, the construction industry arrangements, the specific forms of market control in particular New York sectors that the families had built over decades and that persisted in modified form even after the individuals who had built them were convicted, incarcerated, or killed. The relationships with legitimate businessmen who had found the family's services debt enforcement, labor peace, market discipline useful in ways that legitimate institutions did not provide. These things did not disappear when the bosses were convicted. They adapted. They found new forms. The Bonanno family's trajectory after Massino's cooperation is the most direct evidence available for assessing the long-term consequences of what his cooperation produced. With Massino cooperating and Massino convicted and sentenced to life, the family lacked the leadership necessary to reconstitute itself in anything like its previous form. The structural knowledge that had been encoded in the leadership, the specific arrangements, the financial channels, the personnel relationships had been transferred through the cooperation of Massino and Vitale and the others who had preceded them to the federal government. The FBI's understanding of the Bonanno family's internal workings was, by the mid-2000s, more detailed than that of most of the family's remaining members. The family continued to exist. This is the first and most important fact about its trajectory. It was not eliminated. It was not dissolved. It was not reduced to a state in which its formal existence was purely ceremonial in the way that some of the other families had been in the years immediately following major prosecutions. But its form changed. In the years following Massino's cooperation, the Bonanno family operated with a succession of acting bosses, men who held the position for periods of months or years before being arrested, convicted, or forced to step aside. The instability of the leadership structure was not incidental. It was a direct consequence of the prosecution's success. Every man who accepted the formal position of boss or acting boss accepted, simultaneously, a heightened exposure to federal scrutiny. The position itself had become a liability. This represented a genuine structural change from the family's historical operation. Under Massino, the boss position had been held continuously by a single man for more than 2 decades, a period of organizational stability unusual even by the standards of the 5 families. After his cooperation, the position turned over repeatedly within a span of years. Each transition disrupted institutional memory, fractured existing relationships, and created the kind of internal uncertainty that Massino had spent his tenure specifically designing against. The family's revenue streams narrowed. The labor union relationships that had been a significant source of income and influence for the New York families, generally relationships built over decades through a combination of strategic investment, intimidation, and the provision of services that the families were uniquely positioned to provide, had been substantially disrupted by the prosecutions of the late 1980s and 1990s. The construction industry arrangements that had been a particular source of Bonanno family income had been the subject of repeated federal investigations and consent decrees that altered the industry structure in ways that made those arrangements more difficult to sustain. The family remained active. According to FBI assessments made public in the years following Massino's sentencing, the Bonanno family continued to engage in traditional organized crime activities, loan sharking, illegal gambling, extortion, narcotics distribution at various levels of the supply chain. These activities produced revenue. They sustained a membership, reduced but real. They maintained the organizational identity and the cultural continuity that are, in the long-term analysis of criminal organizations, as important as any specific operational capacity. But the scale was different. The ambition was different. The relationship to the city's legitimate economic and political life was different. The Bonanno family of the late 2000s and 2010s was not the Bonanno family of the Massino years. Whether that difference represented the kind of change that the prosecution had been designed to produce a permanent, structural reduction in the organization's capacity to cause harm, or whether it represented a temporary reduction that would eventually reverse as the organization adapted, rebuilt, and reconstituted under new leadership with new methods, is a question that the available evidence does not definitively answer. The historical pattern is not encouraging. The Bonanno family's trajectory was not unique. The other 4 New York families underwent comparable transformations in the period following the major RICO prosecutions of the late 20th century, and comparing those trajectories reveals something about the mechanisms of both decline and persistence that the Bonanno case alone cannot. The Gambino family, largest and most powerful during the Gotti era, did not collapse after his 1992 conviction. It adapted by the mid-2000s. Federal assessments indicated it remained one of the most active organized crime entities in the New York area. The Genovese family demonstrated the most resilience. The decentralized structure that Gigante had developed, the operational architecture built specifically to resist the prosecution models that had dismantled the others, proved durable in ways that Massino's cell structure, for all its sophistication, ultimately had not. Federal reports in the years following Gigante's death indicated that the Genovese family remained the most operationally significant of the 5, with the deepest penetration of legitimate business and labor sectors. The Lucchese and Colombo families experienced different forms of disruption prosecutions, internal conflict, leadership instability, and emerged from those disruptions reduced but functional. Neither was eliminated. Across all 5 families, the pattern was the same. disruption, reduction, adaptation, persistence. Not elimination, never elimination. The mechanism varied by family, but the result did not. The activities that sustained these organizations, loan sharking, gambling, low-level extortion, the specific economic arrangements that required neither a formal hierarchy nor a public presence to function, did not require the institutional infrastructure the prosecutions had dismantled. They required only the conditions that had always sustained them. Those conditions had not changed. The claim has been made by journalists, by former prosecutors, by analysts of organized crime that the Massino cooperation represented a turning point after which the traditional American Mafia could no longer function as it had, that the boss's willingness to cooperate and to wear a wire against his own successor constituted an irreversible rupture in the institutional culture that had sustained organized crime for a century, that omerta, once broken at that level, could not be reconstructed in a form that carried genuine authority. The claim is not without merit. The specific mechanism through which omerta had functioned not as an ethical commitment, as the cultural mythology maintained, but as a strategic equilibrium maintained by the convergence of interests, had been exposed. The exposure was public. It was documented in court records that were available to anyone who wanted to understand what had happened. Every subsequent member of every organized crime family who contemplated cooperation now did so with the knowledge that the most disciplined boss of his generation, a man who had spent 20 years specifically designing against the mechanisms of organizational failure, had made the calculation and arrived at cooperation. That knowledge changed the calculation for everyone who came after, not by making cooperation more honorable. The cultural framework of organized crime still characterized cooperation as betrayal, but by making the cost-benefit analysis of maintaining silence more transparent by demonstrating, in a case with no ambiguity about the stakes, that the institutional authority that silence was supposed to protect was not, in fact, absolute, that it could be dissolved by a sufficient shift in the variables. The cascade of cooperations that had preceded Massino's from Vitale, from Lino, from Tartaglione, from the other Bonanno members who had provided information, had each been explainable within the traditional framework. These were men who had been marginalized, or who had personal grievances, or who had faced charges severe enough that cooperation was the only plausible path to a life outside prison. Each cooperation could be contained as an individual failure without requiring a systemic revision of the framework. Massino's cooperation could not be contained that way. He was not marginalized. He had no personal grievance against the organization he was helping to prosecute. He had been the boss. He had been the man who most fully embodied, for the longest period, the institutional claim that the silence held absolutely. When he made a different calculation, the institutional claim lost something it could not recover, not through any single subsequent event, but through the accumulation of the knowledge that the claim had been demonstrated to be conditional. This is the strongest version of the argument that Massino's cooperation changed organized crime in a durable way. It is also not the whole story. The argument that Massino killed the Mafia or mortally wounded it, or permanently altered its trajectory, rests on a theory of institutional change that the historical record does not fully support. Institutions do not die because their founding myths are exposed as myths. They persist because they provide services, economic, social, political, that the communities they operate in need or want, and that legitimate institutions do not adequately provide. The exposure of the myth changes the institution's self-presentation. It may change the specific mechanisms through which it operates. It does not, by itself, eliminate the demand for what the institution provides. The demand for what the American Mafia provided had not disappeared by the time Massino walked out of federal custody in 2013. The specific forms of market control construction, waste management, labor sectors had been disrupted, but what had changed was not the underlying structure. What had changed was who was filling those gaps. The most significant development in organized crime in the United States in the period following the major RICO prosecutions of the late 20th century was not the disappearance of organized criminal enterprise. It was the transformation of the landscape in which organized criminal enterprise operated, a transformation that, in important respects, made the environment more favorable to new entrants than it had been when the established families dominated it. The Italian-American families had, at the height of their power, operated something close to a cartel, a structure that controlled entry into particular markets and that used the threat of violence to discipline competitors and maintain market share. The prosecutions disrupted the cartel structure. They reduced the family's capacity to enforce market discipline, and in doing so, they opened space that other organizations with different ethnic bases, different operational structures, different geographic routes were positioned to fill. This was not an outcome that the prosecution strategy had been designed to produce. It was not an outcome that advocates of the prosecution strategy generally acknowledged. The narrative of the RICO era was a narrative of law enforcement success, the families weakened, the convictions mounting, the cooperation cascades producing more information, more prosecutions, more convictions. The narrative was accurate in what it described. It was incomplete in what it omitted. The organized crime landscape in the United States at the time of Massino's release was significantly different from the landscape that had existed at the height of the five families' power. It was not more orderly. It was not less violent. It was not characterized by the kinds of structural arrangements the Commission, the formal protocols governing inter-family relationships, the mechanisms for resolving disputes without resort to open conflict that the traditional family structure had maintained. In some respects, the disruption of those structures had made the environment more volatile, not less. The specific organizations that had expanded into the space created by the family's diminishment varied by geography and by market sector. In some cities, traditional organized crime structures that had been less targeted by the federal prosecution strategy organizations outside the five-family New York framework had grown. In other contexts, newer organizations with different structures and different bases had developed. The mechanisms of market control had evolved. The labor-union relationships that had been the most important channel of organized crime influence into the legitimate economy had been substantially disrupted, but influence over particular economic sectors had not disappeared. It had taken different forms that were, in some cases, more difficult for traditional law enforcement tools to identify and prosecute. The specific question of what happened to the neighborhoods and communities where the five families had historically operated is more complex and less frequently addressed in the public discussion of organized crime prosecution. The families had not merely been criminal enterprises operating in those communities. They had been, in a distorted and ultimately harmful way, part of the social fabric of those communities. They had provided a form of dispute resolution. They had enforced a form of order. They had created employment, both in their criminal operations and through their relationships with legitimate businesses that operated under their protection or patronage. They had, in some documented cases, provided the kind of localized social services assistance to families in financial difficulty, enforcement of a certain code of behavior in public spaces that legitimate institutions had not provided. This is not an argument for organized crime. The form of order the families maintained was imposed through violence and the threat of violence, and the communities that operated under their authority did so without meaningful choice. The social services they provided were the byproduct of a system built on exploitation, and the communities that received them paid a price in reduced legitimate institutional development, distorted economic development, and the perpetuation of a culture of silence that protected criminal activity at the expense of those most harmed by it. But the dismantlement of that system, the prosecution-driven disruption of the family's institutional capacity, did not automatically produce better alternatives. In some cases, it produced a vacuum. In some cases, the vacuum was filled by other criminal organizations. In some cases, it was filled by nothing at all. The communities where the families had operated did not, as a rule, receive the investment, institutional development, and legitimate economic opportunity that would have been necessary to fill the space the prosecutions opened. They received the prosecutions. They did not always receive what came after. This dimension of the prosecution's consequences is the least examined in the public record and the most difficult to assess from available evidence. Its absence from the standard narrative of RICO-era success is itself a feature worth noting. The federal law enforcement community's response to the Massino prosecution and cooperation did not take the form of a public reassessment of the prosecution strategy. That is not how institutional self-evaluation typically operates. What it produced, over the years following the cooperation, was a set of adjustments, modifications to investigative technique, to prosecutorial strategy, to the specific ways in which cooperation agreements were structured and deployed that reflected the lessons the Massino case had made available. The Massino case provided a template. Cooperation at the highest level of a criminal hierarchy was achievable. The case demonstrated that with sufficient pressure, at the right moment, in the right sequence, even the most disciplined boss would make a different calculation. The cascade technique using each cooperation to develop leverage for the next, until the hierarchy had been turned against itself from the top down, was refined through the Bonanno prosecution into a documented method that subsequent organized crime prosecutions drew on directly. These were genuine advances in investigative capacity. They did not represent a reassessment of the prosecution strategy's underlying theory. The refinements were refinements in how to implement the theory, not in whether the theory was correct. The evidence that the theory was, at best, incomplete. The persistence of organized criminal enterprise in the communities and industries where the families had operated, the migration of criminal market control to new organizational forms, the absence of the legitimate institutional development that would have been necessary to permanently alter the conditions that sustained organized crime was available in the public record. It was not the focus of institutional attention. 7 episodes, 1 family, 1 man, 1 cooperation. The story of Joseph Massino and the Bonanno crime family is, in the most immediate sense, the story of an organization's rise, consolidation, and dismantlement. A narrative of how a criminal enterprise built itself into a significant institution over more than a century, and how that institution was, over a period of decades, subjected to a sustained prosecution effort that ultimately produced convictions at every level of the hierarchy. But it is also something more specific than that. It is the story of the limits of institutional self-understanding of what happens when an organization's most fundamental claim about itself is tested by circumstances it could not fully control. The Bonanno family's claim, the claim that all 5 families made about themselves, was that the men inside the organization were bound by something more durable than self-interest, that the code was not a strategic instrument, but an ethical one, that there was a meaningful difference between the kind of man who maintained it and the kind of man who did not, that the institution was, in some fundamental sense, held together by something that transcended the individual calculations of its members. The prosecution, and specifically the cooperation of Joseph Massino, demonstrated that this claim was not accurate, not because the men who made it were dishonest, or because the culture that produced it was cynical, but because the claim was, structurally, false. The institution was held together by the convergence of individual interests. When those interests ceased to converge, the institution ceased to hold. This is not a lesson specific to organized crime. It is a lesson about institutions generally, about the gap between the claims institutions make about the commitments of their members and the reality of what holds those members in the institution, about what happens when that gap is exposed, when circumstances produce a situation in which the claim is tested against the actual preferences of the people who were supposed to embody it. The Bonanno family failed that test in a specific and documented way. So did every other New York family, in their own ways. During the same period, the test was the same. The circumstances varied. The outcomes were, in their essential structure, identical when the costs of maintaining the institutional commitment exceeded the individual benefits. Individuals did not maintain the commitment. They did what people do when the costs exceed the benefits. They changed their behavior. The prosecution had been designed to change the cost-benefit structure precisely to produce this outcome. It succeeded. The cooperation cascade it produced from Vitale to Massino to the downstream prosecutions that Massino's information enabled was the designed result of a deliberate strategy. What the strategy had not been designed to produce and what it did not produce was a durable change in the conditions that had made the institution possible in the first place. The economic conditions, the social conditions, the specific features of the communities where the families had operated that had made what the families offered valuable or at least preferable to the alternatives that legitimate institutions provided. Those conditions persisted, and in their persistence, they continued to provide the substrate from which new institutional forms, some resembling the old ones, some significantly different, could and did develop. In 2013, Joseph Massino was released from federal custody. He was 69 years old. There was no organization waiting for him. There were no associates, no social club, no hierarchy. The men he had known for 30 years were dead, in prison, or in their own versions of whatever arrangement allowed them to exist outside the institutions they had destroyed or been destroyed by. The family he had rebuilt from near collapse in the early 1990s, that he had kept intact through 2 decades of federal pressure, that he had spent a decade dismantling from inside a federal facility, that family continued to exist. But it was not his family anymore. It had never been his to keep. He entered the Federal Witness Protection Program. The public record does not describe what came after that. A new name, a new city, the specific geography of a life rebuilt at 69, without the identity that had organized the preceding 40 years. The street in Howard Beach where he had lived, the restaurant he had owned, the social clubs he had closed because he understood, earlier than most, that visibility was vulnerability, the organizational infrastructure he had maintained longer than any of his contemporaries, the code he had built his identity around and then, in a federal conference room in the summer of 2004, methodically set aside. None of it remained in a form he could return to. The families of the 7 men he had ordered killed received, if they were fortunate, a location and a confirmation. They lived the years between the disappearance and that confirmation in a form of uncertainty that the legal process acknowledged without remedying. One man walked out, others did not. That asymmetry is the human record of the case, and it does not resolve cleanly. So did Joseph Massino kill the Mafia? The question is posed seriously, not rhetorically. It has been asked in various forms by people who have studied the case carefully and who have reached different conclusions. The most precise answer available from the record is he contributed substantially to the dismantlement of a specific institutional form of organized crime that had dominated the American criminal landscape for more than half a century. The 5-family structure, with its commission, its formal hierarchy, its pretension to something resembling a governing authority over criminal enterprise, its claim to the specific cultural identity that Omerta had encoded that specific form, did not survive the prosecution era in anything like the shape it had held at its height. That is significant. It should be acknowledged as significant. It is not the same as saying that organized crime was diminished in a way that produced corresponding improvements in the communities most affected by it. The evidence for that conclusion is not available in the public record, and the logic that would support it, that dismantling the institutional form necessarily improves the underlying conditions, is not well supported by the historical pattern. It is not the same as saying that the prosecution strategy that produced the Massino cooperation was the most effective possible approach to the problem it was designed to address. There is no counterfactual against which to measure it. The path not taken is not available for assessment. And it is not the same as saying that what replaced the old institutional form was better for the people whose lives it touched. The evidence on this question points in multiple directions and does not support a simple conclusion. What can be said with confidence is the weight. The prosecution of Joseph Massino and the cooperation that it eventually produced represented the federal law enforcement strategy's most complete success against organized crime at the level of the individual target, the boss most committed to organizational survival, the man who had most precisely understood the threat and most systematically designed against it, the cooperation that had been, by every institutional measure, the least probable outcome. It happened. It produced what it was designed to produce. What remains unresolved is whether producing what a strategy was designed to produce is sufficient to call the strategy a success, whether the criteria by which success was defined were adequate to the complexity of the problem, whether the institutions that claimed success were asking the right questions. Joseph Massino was released from federal custody in 2013. The Bonanno family continues to exist. The other 4 families continue to exist. Organized criminal enterprise in the United States continues to exist in forms that are significantly different from those that the RICO prosecutions targeted, and in conditions that have not been fundamentally altered by the prosecution's success. The silence was broken. What the breaking of the silence revealed was not only what the silence had been hiding, it revealed what the silence had been built on, and what it was built on: the conditions, the economic structures, the social arrangements, the institutional gaps that organized crime had filled for more than a century. Those things did not end when the silence did. Somewhere, in a city the Federal Witness Protection Program does not disclose, a man named Joseph Massino is living under a name that is not his own. He is no longer a boss, no longer a defendant, no longer a cooperating witness. The identities that organized his life for 60 years have been removed, one by one, by the same process. A man, aging, in a house that does not carry his history. In the neighborhoods where the Bonanno family once operated, the social clubs are closed. The men who knew what the family was are gone to prison, to graves, to other names. The street corners remain. The specific geometry of need and supply and power that organized crime filled for a century that remains. Waiting. The street is still there. It has never been empty for long.